I've been driving trucks for over a decade now, and I thought I'd seen it all. But what happened that night in West Virginia? It's something I'll never forget. It was a Tuesday evening, just like any other. I was hauling a load of electronics from Columbus, Ohio to Charlotte, North Carolina. The first part of the trip had been smooth sailing, clear skies, light traffic, and good tunes on the radio. I even treated myself to a big cup of coffee at my favorite truck stop outside of Charleston. Little did I know how much I'd need that caffeine boost later. As I hit the mountains of West Virginia, the weather took a turn for the worse. The fog rolled in thick and fast, like someone had thrown a wet blanket over the world. My headlights barely cut through it, creating an eerie tunnel of light that seemed to stretch on forever. I had to slow down to a crawl, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the steering wheel. The clock on my dashboard read 11:47 p.m. when I first noticed something was off. The engine started making this weird rattling noise, like a bunch of marbles in a tin can. At first I tried to ignore it, hoping it was just the road or the wind playing tricks on me. But then the truck began to lose power, struggling to climb even the gentlest inclines. I knew I had to pull over and check it out. The problem was, there wasn't much room on that mountain road. The shoulder was narrow, barely wide enough for my rig, and right next to it was a steep ravine that disappeared into the fog. It wasn't ideal, but I didn't have much choice. I couldn't risk the engine giving out completely on one of those hairpin turns. Slowly, carefully, I guided my truck onto the shoulder. The tires crunched on the gravel, and I could feel the right side of the rig tilt slightly towards the ravine. I put on my hazard lights, their steady blinking creating an orange glow in the mist. I sat there for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled down. The fog pressed against the windows, so thick I could barely see the hood of my own truck. It was like being trapped in a cloud. I took a deep breath, grabbed my flashlight, and carefully climbed out of the cab. The moment I opened the door, the cold, damp air hit me like a slap in the face. It was the kind of chill that seeps into your bones, making everything feel just a little bit harder. My boots crunched on the gravel as I made my way to the front of the truck, one hand trailing along the side to keep my bearings in the thick fog. I popped the hood and propped it open, leaning in to inspect the engine. The heat rising from it created swirls in the mist, and the smell of hot oil and metal filled my nostrils. I swept my flashlight back and forth, trying to spot anything obviously wrong. Everything looked normal at first glance, but that rattling sound was definitely coming from somewhere in there. As I was leaning over the engine, trying to trace a wire that looked a bit loose, I heard it. The sound of tires screeching in the distance, getting closer fast. Way too fast for these conditions. I straightened up, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. The noise got louder and louder, echoing off the mountain walls. Suddenly, headlights burst through the mist, two bright beams cutting through the fog like lasers. They were coming right at me, way over the center line. I froze for a split second, caught in the glare like a deer. Then my body kicked into gear and I scrambled to get out of the way. But I was too slow. Or maybe the driver was just going too fast. Either way, it all happened in the blink of an eye. The car came flying around the bend, tires squealing as the driver finally saw my truck and tried to swerve. But they were going too fast, and the road was too slick. The car fishtailed, its back end swinging wide. I barely had time to throw my arms up to protect my face before the car clipped the open hood of my truck. There was a sickening crunch of metal on metal, and the hood slammed shut with enough force to shake the entire rig. If my hands had still been in there, they would have been crushed for sure. The impact sent me stumbling backward. My feet slipped on the wet pavement, and suddenly there was nothing beneath me but air. For a heart-stopping moment, I was falling, the fog swirling around me as I tipped over the edge of the ravine. In that split second, 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. I saw my wife's face, heard my kids' laughter. I thought about all the things I'd never get to do, all the places I'd never see. I was sure this was it. This was how I was going to die. But then, by some miracle, my hand caught the guardrail. I latched onto it with everything I had, my entire body dangling over the abyss. The metal dug into my palm, slick with rain and my own sweat, but I didn't dare loosen my grip. I could hear rocks and dirt falling from where my feet were scrabbling against the cliff face, disappearing into the fog below. I hung there, my arms screaming in pain, listening to the sound of the car that hit me skidding off into the distance. The driver never stopped, never came back to see if I was okay. I was alone, suspended over a drop that would surely kill me if I let go. Time seemed to stretch on forever as I dangled there. Each second felt like an hour, each minute an eternity. My shoulders burned, the muscles feeling like they were being torn from the bone. But the fear of falling kept me holding on, my fingers locked around that cold metal rail like a vice. I tried to pull myself up, but my feet couldn't find any purchase on the wet rock face. Each time I'd try to swing my leg up, I'd slip, sending another shower of pebbles cascading into the unseen depths below. The fog swirled around me, so thick I couldn't even see the ground. For all I knew, I could have been hanging over a drop of 10 feet or 1,000. Slowly, painfully, I managed to get my other hand on the guardrail. Inch by agonizing inch, I pulled myself up. My muscles were on fire, sweat pouring down my face despite the cold night air. When I finally got my elbows over the rail, I thought I might pass out from the effort and the rush of relief. With one final Herculean effort, I dragged myself over that guardrail. I collapsed on the pavement, gasping for air, my chest heaving. The rough asphalt scraped my face, but I didn't care. I was alive. I'd made it. I don't know how long I lay there just breathing, feeling the solid ground beneath me. It could have been minutes or hours. Eventually, I managed to push myself up to my hands and knees, then to my feet. My legs shook like I'd just run a marathon, and every muscle in my body ached. When I could finally stand without feeling like I was going to fall over, I surveyed the damage. The hood of my truck was dented and scraped where the car had hit it. The metal crumpled like it was made of tinfoil. Glass and plastic from the other vehicle's headlight were scattered across the road, glittering in the glow of my hazard lights. I looked over the edge of the ravine, into the fog-filled darkness below. The drop seemed to go on forever, a void that had nearly claimed my life. I stumbled back, suddenly dizzy, and leaned against my truck for support. My hand was torn up from gripping the guardrail, blood mixing with dirt and gravel, but it was a small price to pay. A few inches to the left or right, a moment's less reaction time, and I wouldn't be standing here at all. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and called for help. The 911 operator's voice was calm and reassuring as she told me help was on the way. I climbed back into my truck to wait, not wanting to be out on that narrow shoulder any longer than I had to be. When the state troopers finally arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the fog like a lighthouse beacon, I gave my statement. They took some pictures of the damage and the skid marks left by the other vehicle, but with the fog and the lack of witnesses, they said it was unlikely they'd ever find the driver who hit me. I got my truck towed to a nearby garage and spent the night in a motel, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was falling again. The next day, as soon as my truck was repaired, I finished my delivery. But things weren't the same after that night. Hey there. Hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. And now. I've been driving trucks for nearly 2 decades, crisscrossing the country more times than I can count. But that run through Montana, it's the one that still keeps me up at night. It was supposed to be a routine haul, just another day on the job. I was transporting a load of medical supplies from Seattle to Minneapolis. Crucial stuff, you know? The kind of cargo that makes you feel like you're doing something important, even if you're just the guy behind the wheel. I'd been on the road for about 10 hours when I hit the mountain pass in western Montana. It was late afternoon, and the sky was starting to darken. Not from the setting sun, mind you, but from storm clouds rolling in fast and mean. At first, it was just a light drizzle, nothing I hadn't dealt with 100 times before. I flicked on my wipers and kept on trucking, but as I climbed higher into the mountains, that drizzle turned into a downpour. The rain came down in sheets so thick I could barely see 10 feet in front of my truck. My wipers were going full tilt, but they might as well have been toothpicks for all the good they were doing. The road ahead was a blur of gray, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning that lit up the sky. I slowed down to a crawl, both hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The wind was picking up too, buffeting my rig and making it feel like I was wrestling a bull instead of driving a truck. As I rounded a bend, hugging the mountain on my right and a steep drop on my left, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was water flowing across the road. Not just puddles, but actual streams of muddy water cutting across the asphalt. I knew this wasn't good. In these mountains, rain like this can loosen the soil, cause landslides. But what choice did I have? I couldn't exactly back up on this narrow road, and there was nowhere to turn around. All I could do was press on and hope for the best. That's when I heard it. A low rumble, like distant thunder, but somehow different. It was coming from the mountain itself. I glanced out my passenger window, squinting through the rain, and that's when I saw it. The entire hillside seemed to be moving. It was like the mountain had suddenly turned to liquid, a massive wave of mud and rocks rushing down towards the road. Towards me. I stomped on the gas, trying to outrun the slide, but it was no use. The mud hit the road behind me with a sound like a freight train. I felt my trailer fishtail as the road beneath it started to give way. For a moment, just a split second, I thought I might make it. Then I felt the truck tilt. The steering wheel jerked in my hands as the tires on the left side lost traction. I was sliding, the entire rig moving sideways towards the edge of the cliff. Time seemed to slow down. I could see the guardrail getting closer, bending under the weight of my truck. Beyond it, nothing but a sheer drop into darkness. In that moment, I knew I had a choice to make. Stay with the truck and hope for a miracle, or... I didn't even finish the thought. My body was moving before my mind could catch up. I yanked the door open, the wind and rain hitting me like a physical blow. The truck was still sliding, picking up speed. It was now or never. I jumped. The impact knocked the wind out of me. I hit the road hard and rolled, the rough asphalt scraping my skin through my clothes. Mud and rain soaked me instantly as I tumbled, desperately trying to get away from the edge. I heard a deafening crash of metal. Risking a glance over my shoulder, I saw my truck break through the guardrail. The headlights illuminated nothing but rain as the entire rig tipped over the edge and disappeared from view. I scrambled to my feet, slipping in the mud, and staggered away from the edge. My ears were ringing, my whole body aching from the fall. But I was alive. I'd made it out. The full impact of what had just happened hit me all at once. My truck, my cargo, everything, gone in an instant. If I'd hesitated for even a second longer. I don't know how long I stood there in the rain, staring at the gaping hole in the guardrail where my truck had gone over. It could have been minutes or hours. The storm raged on, indifferent to the destruction it had caused. Eventually, I managed to pull myself together enough to realize I needed help. My phone had somehow survived the fall, protected in my jacket pocket. With shaking hands, I dialed 911. The wait for help felt like an eternity. I paced back and forth, staying well away from the edge, jumping at every sound. The mountainside was still unstable, small rivulets of mud continuously flowing across the road. When I finally saw the flashing lights of emergency vehicles, the relief was overwhelming. The rescue team had to approach carefully due to the unstable road conditions. They checked me over for injuries. Aside from some cuts and bruises, I was physically okay. As they led me to safety, I took one last look at the scene. The rain was finally starting to let up, but the damage was done. A large section of the road was just... gone. Washed away like it had never been there at all. The magnitude of what I'd survived started to sink in. My truck, my livelihood had disappeared into that abyss. But I was still here. I'd looked death in the face and managed to jump clear. They took me to a nearby hospital for a more thorough checkup. Sitting in the emergency room, still dripping wet and caked in mud, I gave my statement to the police. The highway would be closed indefinitely, they said. My truck? There was no way to recover it anytime soon, if ever. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of the situation settled in. I'd lost everything, my truck, my cargo, all my personal belongings. But I was alive. Somehow I'd made it out of that mountain pass in one piece. The doctors cleared me to leave a few hours later. I stood outside the hospital, the storm now just a light drizzle, and looked up at the mountains in the distance. They looked peaceful now, beautiful even, but I knew the power they held, the danger lurking beneath that serene exterior. I called my dispatcher to report what had happened. There would be paperwork, insurance claims, all sorts of headaches to deal with. But in that moment, all I could think about was how close I'd come to never making that call at all. I never thought much about rest areas before that night in Colorado. They were just pit stops, places to catch a few hours of sleep or grab a quick bite. But now I can't pass one without remembering the night that changed everything. It was mid-December and I was hauling a load of electronics from California to Chicago. The weather had been decent most of the way, but as I crossed into Colorado, things took a turn for the worse. The snow started light, just a few flakes dancing in my headlights. Within an hour, it was a full-blown blizzard. The road disappeared under a blanket of white, and my wipers were working overtime just to keep a small patch of windshield clear. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. I could barely see the taillights of the car in front of me, let alone the lane markers. The wind howled around my truck, pushing against the trailer and making it feel like I was wrestling a giant instead of driving. I'd driven in bad weather before, but this was something else. My knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel so tight, and every gust of wind made my stomach lurch. I knew I had to get off the road before I ended up in a ditch, or worse. That's when I saw the sign for the rest area. It was like a beacon in the storm, promising safety and a chance to wait out the worst of the weather. I signaled, and carefully maneuvered my rig onto the exit ramp, feeling the tires slip and slide on the snow-covered asphalt. The rest area was nearly deserted when I pulled in. Only a couple other trucks were parked in the lot, their running lights glowing dimly through the curtain of snow. I found a spot at the far end of the lot and eased my truck into it, letting out a long breath as I finally put it in park. For a moment I just sat there listening to the wind buffet the truck and watching the snow swirl in my headlights. The cab felt like a cocoon, safe from the chaos outside. I knew I should try to get some sleep. Who knew how long this storm would last? But the adrenaline from the drive was still coursing through my veins. I killed the engine but left the key in the accessory position so I could run the heater. No sense in freezing while I waited out the storm. I climbed into the sleeper cab, pulled off my boots, and settled in with a book, figuring I'd read until I got drowsy. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a loud banging on my door. I sat up, disoriented, my heart pounding in my chest. For a second I thought I'd dreamed it. Then it came again, a frantic pounding that seemed to shake the whole truck. I scrambled to the front seat, wiping condensation from the window to peer out. Through the swirling snow I could make out a figure standing by my door. A man, hunched against the wind, wearing what looked like a thin jacket, definitely not enough for this weather. He must have seen me move because he started shouting, his words barely audible over the howling wind. "Please let me in, I'm freezing out here." I hesitated. Every trucker knows the risks of letting strangers into your cab, but it was brutal out there, and the guy looked like he was in real trouble. What if he'd broken down somewhere and walked to the rest area for help? I couldn't just leave him out there to freeze. Against my better judgment, I cracked the door open. The wind immediately tried to tear it from my grip, and a blast of icy air hit me in the face. "Get in, quick!" I shouted. The man didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled up into the cab, and I quickly shut the door behind him, sealing us off from the storm once again. He stood there shivering violently, snow melting off his clothes and forming a puddle on the floor. Thank you," he stammered through chattering teeth. "I thought I was gonna die out there." "What happened?" I asked, reaching for a spare blanket I kept in the cab. "Your car break down or something?" He nodded, wrapping the blanket around his shoulders. "Yeah, about a mile back. Damn thing just died on me. I've been walking for what feels like hours." I cranked up the heat and offered him a seat. "You're lucky you made it here, that storm's no joke." For a few minutes, we just sat there in silence. I watched him out of the corner of my eye as he slowly stopped shivering, his body relaxing as it warmed up. I was just about to offer him some coffee from my thermos when everything changed. It happened so fast I almost couldn't believe it. One second he was huddled under the blanket, looking pathetic and grateful. The next he was on his feet, a wicked-looking knife in his hand. "Give me your wallet," he snarled, all trace of the shivering, desperate man gone. "And your phone, now." I froze, my mind struggling to catch up with what was happening. This couldn't be real. But the knife in his hand, glinting in the dim light of the cab, was all too real. "Hey man, take it easy," I said, trying to keep my voice calm even as panic clawed at my throat. "You don't want to do this." "Shut up," he snapped. "I'm not playing around. Give me what I want or I'll use this." He waved the knife for emphasis. I slowly reached for my wallet, my mind racing. I couldn't believe this was happening. I'd tried to help this guy, and now he was robbing me. But as my hand closed around my wallet, a different thought hit me. This was my truck, my home away from home, and this bastard was threatening me in it. Something snapped inside me. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was anger, but suddenly I was moving. I lunged forward, grabbing for his wrist, trying to control the knife. He yelled in surprise, slashing wildly. We grappled in the confined space of the cab, knocking into the steering wheel, the gear shift. I felt the knife nick my arm, a sharp sting followed by warmth as blood welled up. But I didn't let go. I managed to slam his arm against the dashboard, and the knife clattered to the floor. He threw a punch that caught me in the jaw, making my head snap back. But I'd been in my share of scraps before, and this guy was no fighter. I got him in a headlock, squeezing as hard as I could. He thrashed and clawed at my arms, but I held on. I don't know how long we struggled like that, but eventually his movements got weaker and then he went limp. I didn't let go right away, terrified it was some kind of trick. But when I finally released him, he slumped to the floor of the cab, unconscious. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely work the radio, but I managed to call for help. The wait for the police felt like an eternity. I kept my eyes on the guy, ready to jump on him if he so much as twitched. When the cops finally arrived, their lights cutting through the snow, I felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly knocked me over. They arrested the guy, still out cold, and took my statement. Turns out, there was no broken down car. He'd been working rest areas up and down I-70, preying on people's kindness. The cop told me I was lucky. The last trucker this guy tried to rob ended up in the hospital. As I watched them drive away, the guy in the back of a patrol car, I suddenly felt exhausted. The adrenaline wore off, leaving me shaky and nauseous. I looked at my truck, the place I'd always felt safe on the road, and for the first time it felt vulnerable. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. For weeks after, every time I pulled into a rest area, I'd break out in a cold sweat, my eyes darting to every shadow. The physical wounds healed quick enough, but that feeling of violation, of danger lurking behind a mask of desperation, that stuck with me. They say no good deed goes unpunished. I don't know if I believe that, but I do know one thing. These days, when someone knocks on my door in the middle of the night, no matter how bad the weather is, that door stays locked. Detroit at 2 a.m. is a different world. The streets are empty, the factories are silent, and the only light comes from flickering street lamps that cast long shadows across the cracked pavement. I've been driving trucks for 15 years and I thought I'd seen it all. But that night in Detroit, that's the night that still keeps me up sometimes. I was hauling a load of electronics, high-end stuff, you know, TVs, gaming consoles, the kind of cargo that makes you a little more alert, a little more cautious. The warehouse was in one of those industrial areas that used to be bustling but now looks like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. Abandoned buildings, broken windows, graffiti everywhere. As I pulled up to the address, I had to double-check my GPS. The place looked deserted. No lights, no security guard, nothing. Just a big, dark building looming in front of me. I sat there for a minute, engine idling, wondering if I had the right place. But the numbers matched and I had a job to do. I backed the truck up to the loading dock, the beeping of my reverse alarm sounding way too loud in the quiet night. As I cut the engine, the silence hit me like a physical thing. No traffic noise, no distant sirens, just nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and clipboard and hopped out of the cab. The metal stairs clanged under my boots as I made my way down to the dock. I tried the door, locked. Of course. I was early, and it looked like I'd be waiting a while for someone to show up. I decided to start unloading anyway. No sense wasting time, right? I lowered the lift gate and started moving pallets onto it. The work was monotonous, but it kept my mind off the creepy surroundings. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. At first I thought I was imagining things, but then I heard them again, clearer this time. Gravel crunching under shoes, getting closer. I turned, sweeping my flashlight beam across the parking lot. "Hello?" I called out. "Anyone there?" No answer. Just more footsteps, faster now. And then they were there. 3 men, seemingly appearing out of nowhere. They stepped into the edge of my flashlight beam and I felt my stomach drop. These weren't warehouse workers coming to help with the delivery. The biggest one, a guy with a shaved head and arms covered in tattoos, was holding a baseball bat. He slapped it against his palm as he looked at me, then at the open trailer behind me. "Well, well," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Looks like Christmas came early, boys." I took a step back, my mind racing. The cab. I had to get back to the cab. "Listen, guys," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You don't want to do this. The cops—" "Shut up," Tattoo interrupted. "Here's how this is gonna go. You're gonna step aside, and we're gonna take what we want. You play nice, maybe we don't hurt you too bad." I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran. I heard them shouting behind me, their footsteps pounding on the pavement. The cab seemed a mile away. My lungs were burning, and I could hear them getting closer. I reached the door, yanked it open, and threw myself inside. I slammed the door shut just as a hand grabbed for me. I hit the lock button, and not a second too soon. The guy with the bat slammed into the door, his face inches from mine through the window. "Open the fucking door," he screamed, slamming the bat against the side of the truck. I scrambled for my phone, my hands shaking so bad I could barely dial. I hit 911 and pressed the phone to my ear, never taking my eyes off the men outside. "911, what's your emergency?" "I need help," I shouted into the phone. "I'm at a warehouse on—" I rattled off the address, my words tumbling over each other. "There are men trying to rob me. They have weapons. Please hurry." The dispatcher tried to keep me calm, asked me questions, but I could barely focus on her words. Outside, the men were circling the truck like wolves. One of them picked up a piece of concrete from the ground and hurled it at my windshield. The glass spiderwebbed but held. "They're trying to break in," I told the dispatcher. "Please, where are the police?" "Units are on their way, sir. Try to stay calm. Are you in a secure location?" Before I could answer, there was a tremendous crash. My driver's side mirror exploded in a shower of glass and plastic. The guy with the bat had smashed it clean off. "Oh God," I moaned into the phone. "Please hurry." The next few minutes felt like hours. The men outside kept up their assault on the truck. They smashed out my headlights, tried to force the doors, screamed threats at me through the windows. I huddled in the center of the cab, as far from the windows as I could get, praying the glass would hold. I don't know how long it went on. Time seemed to stretch and warp. But suddenly, I heard something that made my heart leap. Sirens. Faint at first, but growing louder by the second. The men heard it too. They stopped their attack, looking at each other in panic. "Cops!" one of them yelled. "Let's go!" They took off running, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared. A moment later, 2 police cars came screaming into the parking lot, lights flashing. I stayed in the cab until an officer approached, shining his flashlight on me and asking if I was okay. My legs felt like jelly as I climbed down from the truck. I gave my statement to the police, my voice shaky as I recounted what had happened. The cops searched the area but found no sign of the men. They took photos of the damage to my truck and told me they'd increase patrols in the area. Small comfort, that. In the end, I was left with a banged-up truck, a delivery I still had to make, and a fear that took a long time to shake. Those men never got caught, as far as I know. And every time I make a night delivery now, especially in unfamiliar areas, I can't help but look over my shoulder, wondering if someone's waiting in the shadows. It was just another scorching day in Texas. I'd been on the road for 14 hours straight, hauling a load of auto parts from Detroit to El Paso. My eyes were heavy, my back was aching, and all I wanted was a hot meal and a few hours of shut-eye. That's why I pulled into the Big Rig Oasis truck stop just outside of Amarillo. The place was bustling, even at 10 p.m. Trucks of all sizes filled the massive parking lot, their engines humming as drivers refueled or grabbed a quick bite. The neon sign of the diner flickered, casting an eerie glow over the weathered asphalt. I maneuvered my rig into an empty spot, cut the engine, and climbed down from the cab. The smell of diesel and greasy food hit me as soon as my feet touched the ground. I stretched, my joints popping after hours of sitting. That's when I first noticed them, two guys standing between a couple of parked semis, maybe 50 feet away. They were facing each other, body language tense. I didn't think much of it at first. Disagreements aren't uncommon at truck stops, especially when everyone's tired and stressed. I started walking towards the diner, my stomach growling at the thought of a burger and fries. But something made me glance back at those two guys. Their voices were getting louder, echoing across the lot. One of them, a big guy with a scraggly beard, jabbed his finger into the chest of the other, a shorter, wiry man with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. "You think you can cut me off like that and get away with it?" the big guy shouted. "You could have killed someone, you idiot." The smaller guy shoved the finger away. "Back off, man. It was an accident. I already said I was sorry." I hesitated, torn between minding my own business and maybe trying to calm things down. Before I could decide, the argument exploded. The big guy lunged forward, grabbing the smaller man by his shirt collar. "Sorry, don't cut it. I ought to teach you a lesson right here." Everything happened so fast after that. The smaller guy, his face twisted with fear and anger, reached behind his back. When his hand came back into view, my blood turned to ice. He was holding a pistol. "Let go of me!" he screamed, waving the gun wildly. "I said let go!" The big guy's eyes widened. He released his grip and took a step back, hands raised. "Whoa, man. Take it easy. No need for that." But the smaller guy was beyond reason. His hand was shaking, the gun moving erratically between the big guy and the ground. People around us started to notice, shouts of alarm rising from the crowd. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move or even breathe. I knew I should run, find cover, do something. But it was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. I couldn't look away. "You think you can push me around?" the smaller guy yelled, his voice cracking. "You think I'm just gonna take it?" The big guy kept backing up, hands still raised. "Come on, buddy, put that thing away, we can talk about this." For a split second, I thought it might end there. The smaller guy's arm lowered slightly, his grip on the gun loosening. Then someone in the growing crowd shouted, "He's got a gun," and everything went to hell. The sound of the gunshot was deafening. A flash of light, a puff of smoke, and the big guy stumbled backward. His hands went to his chest, and when he pulled them away, they were dark with blood. Time seemed to stop. The big guy swayed for a moment, a look of disbelief on his face. Then he crumpled to the ground like a marionette with its strings cut. Chaos erupted. People were screaming, running in every direction. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the diesel fumes, making me nauseous. The shooter stood there for a moment, staring at the gun in his hand like he couldn't believe what had just happened. Then his head snapped up, his eyes wild and darting around. That's when his gaze locked onto me. I realized with horror that I was the closest person to him, and I was standing right next to my truck. He started moving towards me, the gun now pointed directly at my chest. "Give me your key," he shouted. "Now!" My mind was blank with panic. I fumbled in my pocket for the keys, my hands shaking so bad I could barely grip them. The shooter was getting closer, his face a mask of desperation. "Hurry up!" he screamed, waving the gun. I finally got the keys out, but as I held them up, something in me snapped. This was my livelihood, my home away from home. I couldn't just hand it over to this guy. Instead of tossing him the keys, I turned and ran for the driver's side door. I heard him curse behind me, followed by the sound of pounding footsteps. I reached the door, yanked it open, and started to haul myself up into the cab. A hand grabbed my jacket, trying to pull me back. I twisted around, coming face to face with the shooter. His eyes were wide, sweat pouring down his face. We grappled for a moment, him trying to drag me out, me clinging to the doorframe for dear life. "Get out," he yelled, his breath hot on my face. "I need to get out of here." I don't know where I found the strength, but I managed to kick out, catching him in the stomach. He stumbled back, losing his grip on my jacket. I scrambled into the cab, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The shooter recovered quickly. He lunged for the open door, trying to climb in after me. I kicked at him again, catching him in the shoulder this time. He fell back, but immediately came at me again. We struggled in the doorway of the cab, neither of us gaining the upper hand. His gun was pressed between us, and I was terrified it would go off at any moment. I could hear sirens in the distance, growing louder by the second. With one final surge of adrenaline, I managed to shove him back hard enough to slam the door shut. I hit the lock button just as he grabbed the handle, trying to wrench it open. "Open the door!" he screamed, pounding on the window with the butt of his gun. The glass spiderwebbed, but held. I scrambled across to the passenger side, putting as much distance between us as possible. The shooter kept up his assault on the door, alternating between trying to break the window and yanking on the handle. The sirens were close now. I could see flashing lights reflecting off the chrome of nearby trucks. The shooter noticed too. He gave the door one last frustrated kick, then turned and ran, disappearing between the rows of parked semis. Moments later, the parking lot was flooded with police cars. Officers poured out, guns drawn, shouting orders. I stayed in my cab, shaking, until one of them approached and told me it was safe to come out. The rest of the night was a blur of police statements and paramedics checking me over. I learned that the man who'd been shot was in critical condition but still alive. The shooter was caught trying to hotwire a car at the far end of the lot. As the sun came up, I sat on the step of my truck, a cold cup of coffee in my hands. The police had finally finished with me, and the truck stop was slowly coming back to life. Drivers who'd slept through the whole thing were starting their rigs, ready to hit the road. I stared at the spot where the shooting had happened. There was nothing there now, no sign of the violence that had occurred just hours before. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw it all again. The flash of the gun, the man falling, the wild eyes of the shooter as he tried to take my truck. The Nevada desert stretched out before me, an endless sea of sand and scrub brush under a relentless sun. I'd been on the road for nearly 10 hours, hauling a load of electronics from Salt Lake City to Las Vegas. The monotony of the highway had long since set in, and I found myself yearning for some kind of distraction to break up the tedium. That's when I saw him, a lone figure on the side of the road, thumb outstretched. He was a lanky guy, maybe in his early 30s, with a scruffy beard and a backpack slung over one shoulder. I'd picked up hitchhikers before, and while I knew it wasn't the smartest thing to do, the thought of having someone to talk to for a few hours was too tempting to pass up. I eased my rig onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires as I came to a stop. The guy jogged up to the passenger side, a grateful smile on his face as I leaned over to open the door. "Thanks, man," he said, hoisting himself up into the cab. "I've been out here for hours." "No problem," I replied, checking my mirrors before pulling back onto the highway. "Where are you headed?" "Vegas," he said, settling into the seat. "Got family there?" We fell into easy conversation as the miles ticked by. His name was Mike, and he told me he was a freelance photographer, traveling the country and taking odd jobs to make ends meet. He seemed like a nice enough guy, articulate and friendly, with an easygoing demeanor that made the time pass quickly. About an hour into the drive, I noticed a subtle change in Mike's behavior. His responses became shorter, more clipped, and he started fidgeting in his seat, constantly looking out the windows as if searching for something. "You okay, man?" I asked, glancing over at him. Yeah, he muttered, not meeting my eyes. "Just, do you ever feel like you're being watched?" I chuckled nervously. "Out here? Not much to watch us but the cacti." Mike didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper. That's what they want you to think. But they're always watching, always listening. A knot formed in my stomach. I'd encountered my fair share of oddballs on the road, but something about Mike's sudden intensity set me on edge. Who's watching? I asked, trying to keep my tone light. The government, he hissed, eyes darting around the cab. They've got satellites, drones, hidden cameras everywhere. They're tracking all of us all the time. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. Come on, man. That's just conspiracy theory stuff. Nobody's watching us out here. Mike's head snapped towards me, his eyes wide and wild. That's exactly what they want you to think. Don't you see? You're part of it, aren't you? You're one of them. Before I could react, Mike lunged for the steering wheel. His hands clamped down on it, trying to wrench it to the right. The truck swerved violently, tires screeching on the asphalt. What the hell are you doing? I shouted, fighting to maintain control. The highway shoulder rushed by in a blur, the guardrail just feet away from our front bumper. I won't let you take me in, Mike screamed, still grappling for the wheel. I know what you people do to guys like me. I threw my right arm out, trying to push him back into his seat while steering with my left hand. The truck weaved dangerously across the lane, horns blaring as other vehicles swerved to avoid us. Stop it! I yelled, my voice cracking with panic. You're gonna get us both killed. But Mike was beyond reason. He clawed at my arm, his nails digging into my skin as he tried to pry my hand off the wheel. I could see the crazed look in his eyes, all trace of the friendly guy I'd picked up gone. With a surge of desperate strength, I managed to shove him back for a moment. I cranked the wheel hard to the left, guiding the truck onto the shoulder. The cab shuddered as we left the smooth asphalt for the rough gravel, but I didn't let up on the gas. I needed to get us stopped before Mike could grab the wheel again. As soon as we were clear of the highway, I slammed on the brakes. The truck shuddered and groaned, the load in the trailer shifting ominously behind us. Mike was thrown forward, his head nearly hitting the dashboard. I thought the sudden stop might snap him out of it, but I was wrong. As soon as we came to a halt, he turned on me again, his hands clawing at my face. I won't let you win, he shrieked, spittle flying from his mouth. I'll expose all of you. I raised my arms to protect my face, feeling his nails rake across my forearms. In the confined space of the cab, there wasn't much room to maneuver, but I managed to get my knee up between us, pushing him back towards the passenger door. Get out! I shouted, fumbling for the door handle on his side. Get out now! I found the handle and yanked it, the door swinging open. Mike, still pushing against my knee, suddenly found himself with no support. He tumbled backward, out of the cab, landing hard on the gravel shoulder. I didn't wait to see if he was okay. I lunged across the seat and slammed the door shut, hitting the lock button. Mike was already on his feet, pounding on the door, trying to get back in. You can't hide the truth, he screamed, his face pressed against the window. I'll tell everyone what you're doing. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key back in the ignition. I cranked the engine, threw the truck into gear, and stomped on the accelerator. The tires spun in the gravel for a moment before finding purchase, and then we were moving. In my side mirror, I could see Mike running after the truck, still shouting, but his words were lost in the roar of the engine. I kept my foot heavy on the gas until he was just a tiny figure in the distance, still waving his arms frantically. I drove for another hour before I felt safe enough to pull over at a rest stop. My heart was still pounding, and I could feel the sting of scratches on my arms and face. As I sat there in the parking lot, surrounded by other trucks and families on vacation, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I'd always thought of myself as a good judge of character, someone who could spot trouble a mile away. But Mike had seemed so normal at first. How quickly things had spiraled out of control. How close I'd come to losing control of my rig on a busy highway. It was almost too much to process. It was supposed to be a routine delivery, just another day on the job. I'd been driving trucks for over a decade, and I'd seen my fair share of bad weather. But nothing could have prepared me for that night in Maine. I was hauling a load of electronics to a distribution center in a small town called Millbrook. It was late January, and the forecast had mentioned the possibility of snow. No big deal, I thought. I'd driven through plenty of snowstorms before. As I crossed the state line into Maine, the first few flakes began to fall. They were small and delicate, dancing in my headlights. I didn't think much of it at first. The road was clear, and my rig was handling fine. But within an hour, everything changed. The gentle snowfall turned into a full-blown ice storm. Sleet pelted my windshield, the wipers barely keeping up. The road ahead disappeared under a sheet of ice that seemed to form before my eyes. I slowed down, gripping the wheel tightly as my truck began to slip and slide. Other vehicles had pulled over to the side of the road, their hazard lights blinking weakly through the storm. But I was on a tight schedule. The distribution center was expecting their delivery first thing in the morning, and I was already cutting it close. I should have stopped. I know that now. But at the moment, all I could think about was getting to Millbrook on time. The wind picked up, howling around my cab like some kind of angry spirit. Visibility dropped to almost zero. I could barely see past the hood of my truck. The road signs were just blur of reflective green as I crept past them. That's when it happened. I came around a bend, and suddenly my trailer started to fishtail. I tried to correct, but it was like trying to steer a boat in a hurricane. The wheel was useless in my hands. I felt the moment we left the road. There was a sickening lurch as the cab tilted, and then we were sliding down an embankment. Snow and ice flew past my windows. I braced myself, certain we were about to roll. But we didn't. Instead, there was a bone-jarring impact as the truck slammed into something solid. The engine died, and suddenly everything was quiet except for the howling wind. For a moment, I just sat there, stunned. Then reality set in. I was off the road, in the middle of nowhere, in the worst storm I'd ever seen. I tried to restart the engine, but it was no use. The truck was dead. I reached for my cell phone, praying for a signal, but the screen just showed no service in mocking letters. Panic started to set in. I was trapped. The storm was getting worse by the minute, and nobody knew where I was. I tried the radio, hoping to reach someone, anyone, but all I got was static. As the adrenaline wore off, I began to feel the cold. It seeped into the cab, chilling me to the bone. I checked the temperature gauge on my dashboard, 10 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping fast. I knew I had to conserve heat. I grabbed every piece of clothing I could find, my spare jacket, some old sweatshirts I kept in the sleeper, even the ratty blanket I used for naps at rest stops. I put on layer after layer, but it didn't seem to help. The cold was relentless. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the darkness. The windows of my cab frosted over, cutting me off completely from the outside world. All I could hear was the wind and the occasional creak of metal as the cold contracted my truck. I tried to stay awake, knowing that falling asleep in this cold could be deadly, but exhaustion was setting in. My thoughts became sluggish, and I found myself nodding off despite my best efforts. Every time I jerked awake, the cab seemed colder. My breath froze in the air in front of me, a visible reminder of how dire my situation was. I couldn't feel my toes anymore, and my fingers were stiff and unresponsive. As the night wore on, I started to hallucinate. I saw shapes moving in the frost on my windows, heard voices calling my name. At one point, I was convinced I saw headlights approaching, but when I tried to call out, my voice was a barely audible croak. The worst part was the silence. In between the gusts of wind, there was a stillness so profound it seemed to press against my eardrums. I'd never felt so alone, so cut off from the world. I thought about my family, my friends. Would they miss me? How long would it take for someone to realize I was missing? The thought of dying here, alone in the cold, was almost too much to bear. As the hours dragged on, I felt myself slipping away. The cold had seeped into my bones, and I couldn't stop shivering. My thoughts became disjointed, fragments of memories and fears swirling together. I don't know when I lost consciousness. The last thing I remember is watching my breath slow in the frigid air, the puffs of vapor getting smaller and smaller. The next thing I knew, there was a sound. At first I thought it was part of another hallucination, but it grew louder. A scraping, crunching sound. Then a voice, muffled but real. "Hey, anyone in there?" I tried to respond, but my voice was gone. I managed to lift my arm, though it felt like it weighed a ton, and banged weakly on the window. The voice got closer. "I see movement. Hang on, we're gonna get you out." What followed was a blur. The door of my cab was wrenched open, letting in a blast of icy air. Hands grabbed me, pulled me out. I remember catching a glimpse of a tow truck, its headlights cutting through the swirling snow. The man who found me was a local mechanic named Bill. He'd been out checking for stranded motorists after the storm had finally passed. If he hadn't decided to take that particular road, if he'd been even an hour later. They took me to the local hospital. The doctor said I had severe hypothermia and frostbite on my toes and fingers. It was touch and go for a while, but I pulled through. It took weeks before I could drive again, and months before I could bring myself to take another winter route. Even now, years later, I can't stand the cold. The sound of wind howling around my house keeps me up at night. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as I guided my rig along the endless stretch of highway. It was just another day on the job, another haul across the desert. I'd made this trip countless times before, and nothing about that morning suggested it would be any different. I remember checking my watch. It was just past 2 p.m. The cab of my truck was like an oven, even with the AC cranked to full blast. Outside, the landscape shimmered with heat, mirages dancing on the horizon. I was looking forward to reaching the next truck stop, maybe grabbing a cold drink and stretching my legs. That's when I heard it, a loud pop, followed by a rhythmic thumping. I knew that sound all too well. Flat tire. I eased off the accelerator, guiding my rig onto the shoulder of the road. As I brought the truck to a stop, a plume of dust rose around me, momentarily obscuring my view. I sat there for a moment, listening to the tick of the cooling engine and the hiss of air escaping from the blown tire. The realization sank in. I was stuck in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but desert stretching out in every direction. Grabbing my hat and work gloves, I stepped out of the cab. The heat hit me like a physical force, stealing my breath away. The asphalt radiated warmth, and I could feel it through the soles of my boots. I circled around to the passenger side where I found the culprit, a rear tire shredded beyond repair. With a sigh, I headed to the back of the trailer to grab the spare and the jack. It wasn't my first roadside tire change, but it was never a pleasant task, especially in this heat. As I worked to loosen the lug nuts, sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes. My shirt clung to my back, soaked through in a matter of minutes. But I pressed on, determined to get back on the road as quickly as possible. I was just about to start jacking up the truck when I heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. Looking up, I saw a pickup truck slowing down, pulling onto the shoulder behind my rig. A wave of relief washed over me. Maybe they could lend a hand, make this job go faster. 3 men got out of the pickup. They looked rough around the edges, but hey, out here in the desert, who doesn't? The driver, a tall guy with a scraggly beard, called out as they approached. "Having some trouble there, buddy?" I nodded, wiping sweat from my brow. "Yeah, blew a tire. Wouldn't say no to some help if you're offering." The 3 men exchanged glances, and something in their expressions made my stomach tighten. Before I could react, the driver pulled out a pistol, pointing it straight at me. "Don't move," he growled. "This doesn't have to get messy." My mind went blank. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not now. But the cold metal of the gun barrel pressing against my ribs told me this was all too real. Wallet, phone, anything valuable, now. The second man, shorter but stocky, held out his hand expectantly. With trembling fingers, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet. "Look, guys, you don't need to do this. Just take what you want and go." The third man, who had been silent until now, snorted. "Shut up and hand over your CB radio too, and don't try anything stupid." I watched helplessly as they ransacked my truck, taking anything of value they could find. My phone, my CB radio, Even the emergency cash I kept hidden in the glove compartment, all of it gone in a matter of minutes. As they prepared to leave, the driver turned back to me, a cold smile on his face. "Thanks for your cooperation. Enjoy your stay in the desert." And just like that, they were gone, leaving me in a cloud of dust and disbelief. I stood there watching their taillights disappear into the distance, the reality of my situation slowly sinking in. I was alone. No phone, no radio, no way to call for help. The sun still blazed overhead, and I knew the temperature would only climb higher as the afternoon wore on. I had to make a decision: stay with the truck and hope someone else came along, or start walking. After a moment's hesitation, I grabbed a bottle of water from my cooler. Thankfully, the thieves hadn't bothered with that, and set off down the highway. Each step felt like an eternity, the heat radiating from the asphalt in shimmering waves. I tried to flag down the few cars that passed, but they sped by without slowing. Maybe they thought I was some kind of desert vagrant, or maybe they were just too focused on getting to their air-conditioned destinations to notice me. Hours passed. My water ran out. My mouth felt like it was full of sand, my tongue thick and useless. The sun seemed to hang motionless in the sky, an unblinking eye watching my slow progress. I began to wonder if I'd made the right choice in leaving my truck. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I heard the familiar rumble of a semi-truck behind me. I turned, waving my arms frantically, praying that this driver would stop where others hadn't. The truck slowed, then pulled over. A man leaned out of the driver's side window, concern etched on his weathered face. "You all right, buddy? What happened to you?" The words tumbled out of me in a rush: the flat tire, the robbery, the long walk. The driver, Tom, listened with growing alarm. He helped me into his cab, the cool air inside feeling like heaven against my sunburned skin. Tom radioed for help, then drove me back to my abandoned rig. Highway patrol arrived shortly after, taking my statement and calling for a tow truck. As I sat in the patrol car, sipping water and trying to process everything that had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability that had settled over me. I never thought much about motels before that night in New Mexico. They were just places to crash when you're too tired to keep driving. But now I can't even look at those neon vacancy signs without feeling sick to my stomach. It was supposed to be a routine trip. I was driving cross-country for work, nothing exciting. Just me, my car, and miles of open road. I'd been on the road for about 14 hours when I hit the New Mexico state line. The sun had set hours ago and my eyes were getting heavy. I knew I needed to stop soon. That's when I saw it, a flickering neon sign advertising the Desert Rose Motel. It looked like it had seen better days, but at that point I was too exhausted to care. I just wanted a bed and a few hours of sleep. I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, the gravel crunching under my tires. The office was a small, dimly lit room that smelled of stale cigarettes. The guy at the front desk barely looked up from his magazine when I walked in. He grunted out the price for a single room, and I handed over my credit card without a word. Room 17 was at the far end of the building. The key was attached to a plastic tag so big it could have doubled as a weapon. As I walked to my room, I noticed how quiet everything was. No TV sounds, no voices, just the occasional hum of a car passing on the distant highway. The room itself was about what you'd expect from a place like this. Faded wallpaper, a bed that had seen better days, and a bathroom that I tried not to look at too closely. But it was a place to sleep, and that's all I cared about. I did my usual routine, checked the locks, put my bag on the rickety table, and took a quick shower. The water pressure was weak, but it was enough to wash off the grime of the road. I crawled into bed around 11 p.m., setting my phone alarm for 6 a.m. I had a long drive ahead of me tomorrow. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. It might have been minutes or hours later. All I know is that something pulled me out of a deep sleep. At first, I couldn't figure out what it was. Then I heard it. A soft scratching sound coming from the door. My first thought was that it must be some animal. A stray cat, maybe, or a raccoon looking for food. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. the distinct sound of metal on metal like someone was trying to pick the lock. I lay there, frozen, hoping I was imagining things. But the sound continued, more insistent now. This wasn't an animal. Someone was trying to break into my room. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, my bare feet silent on the worn carpet. The scratching at the door continued, punctuated now by the sound of the doorknob rattling. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, my fingers shaking as I tried to dial 911. The operator's voice seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. I whispered frantically, trying to explain where I was and what was happening. She assured me they were sending someone, but it would take time. The nearest patrol car was at least 45 minutes away. 45 minutes. I looked at the door, watching as the knob turned slightly with each attempt. I didn't have 45 minutes. I hung up and looked around the room, searching for anything I could use to barricade the door. The table was too light, but maybe if I could wedge the chair under the doorknob. As I moved towards the chair, my foot hit something metal. The heater. It was one of those old-fashioned radiators, heavy and solidly built. With a strength I didn't know I had, I managed to drag it in front of the door. It wasn't much, but it was something. The noise I made must have alerted the person outside. The scratching stopped for a moment, then came back with renewed intensity. I heard a muffled voice, but I couldn't make out the words. All I knew was that whoever was out there, they weren't giving up. I retreated to the far corner of the room, clutching my phone like a lifeline. I tried calling the front desk, but no one answered. Was there even anyone there? Or was I completely alone? The minutes crawled by, each one feeling like an hour. The person outside alternated between trying to pick the lock and simply throwing their weight against the door. Each impact made the thin walls shake, and I found myself holding my breath, wondering if this would be the time the lock gave way. I thought about trying to escape through the bathroom window, but it was tiny and barred. I was trapped, with nowhere to go and no way to defend myself. All I could do was wait and pray that help would arrive before the intruder got in. At some point, I became aware of a new sound, sirens in the distance. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own ragged breathing and the continued assault on the door. But they were getting louder. The person outside must have heard them too. The attempts to break in became more frantic, more desperate. I could hear cursing now, punctuated by the sound of something heavy hitting the door repeatedly. The sirens were close now, their wail cutting through the night. I heard tires on gravel, car doors slamming, then voices shouting commands. The assault on my door stopped abruptly. There was a moment of absolute silence, broken only by my own thundering heartbeat. Then a knock on the door, different from before. A voice identified itself as the police, asking me to open up. My legs felt like jelly as I stumbled to the door, pushing aside the heater and fumbling with the lock. When I finally got the door open, I was face to face with two officers, their flashlights momentarily blinding me. Behind them, I could see other officers leading someone away in handcuffs. I caught a glimpse of the person who had spent the last hour trying to break into my room. Just an ordinary-looking man, nothing special about him. Nothing that explained why he had targeted my room, why he had been so determined to get in. The police took my statement, asked if I needed medical attention. I shook my head, even though I felt like I might be sick at any moment. They told me they'd caught the guy trying to run away when they arrived. He had a record, they said, breaking and entering, assault. They'd been looking for him for weeks. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. I had spent over an hour trapped in that room, not knowing if I would make it out alive. Even though the guy never got in, even though I was physically unharmed, I felt changed. Like something fundamental had shifted inside me. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I gave more statements, signed some papers. When dawn broke, I got in my car and drove away, leaving the Desert Rose Motel behind. But the memory of that night, the fear, the helplessness that stayed with me, helplessness. Night deliveries in Chicago were nothing new to me. I'd been driving trucks for over a decade and I thought I'd seen it all. But that night, That night changed everything. It was a Tuesday, just after midnight. The city was quieter than usual, with only the occasional car passing by and the distant wail of a siren breaking the silence. I was making my last drop-off before calling it a night. The GPS on my dashboard showed I was about 15 minutes away from my destination. I remember yawning, reaching for my thermos of coffee. That's when I missed the turn. It was a small mistake, something that happens to every driver now and then. I figured I'd just take the next right and loop back around. No big deal, right? Wrong. As I turned onto the unfamiliar street, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The well-lit main road gave way to darker, narrower streets. Broken streetlights cast long shadows, and the buildings looked more run down. Graffiti covered most of the walls, and trash littered the sidewalks. I knew immediately I'd made a wrong turn into a part of town I shouldn't be in. The GPS was recalculating, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the road. Every instinct told me to turn around, but the streets were too narrow for my rig to maneuver easily. As I approached an intersection, the light turned red. I slowed to a stop, my eyes darting around, taking in my surroundings. That's when I saw them. A group of men standing on the corner. They turned to look at my truck, and I saw one of them nudge another, pointing in my direction. I sat up straighter in my seat, my hand hovering over the gear shift. The men started moving towards my truck, spreading out as they approached. There were 5 of them, maybe 6, young guys wearing hoodies and baggy jeans. One of them had something in his hand, but I couldn't make out what it was. They surrounded my truck, 2 on each side and 1 in front. I could hear them talking, laughing. One of them slapped the side of my trailer, the sound echoing in the quiet street. I locked the doors, even though I knew they were already locked. It was instinct. The one in front, a tall guy with a bandana covering the lower half of his face, stepped closer to my door. He gestured for me to roll down the window. I shook my head, mouthing no through the glass. That's when things escalated. The guy with the bandana started yanking on my door handle, trying to force it open. On the passenger side, another one was doing the same thing. I could hear them shouting now, telling me to open up, threatening what they'd do if I didn't. I reached for my phone, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't hit the right buttons. The banging on the doors and windows grew louder, more insistent. I felt like a caged animal, trapped in my own truck. Suddenly, there was a loud crack. The passenger side window spiderwebbed, small pieces of glass falling onto the seat. One of them had thrown something, a brick, I realized later. They were trying to break in. In that moment, everything seemed to slow down. I could see the triumphant grin on the face of the guy who'd thrown the brick. He was reaching through the broken window, trying to unlock the door. The others were cheering him on, already planning what they'd do once they got inside. I don't remember making a conscious decision. 1 second I was frozen in fear, and the next my foot was slamming down on the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, tires squealing against the pavement. I blew through the red light, narrowly missing a car coming from the left. The sudden movement caught the men off guard. I saw them scrambling to get out of the way in my rearview mirror. The one reaching through the window jerked his arm back, but not before the moving truck caught his sleeve. For a terrifying moment, I thought he was going to be dragged along with me, but his sleeve tore free and I kept going. I didn't slow down, didn't look back. I took random turns, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from there. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I don't know how long I drove like that, running red lights and stop signs, before I finally recognized where I was. I'd made it back to a main road, one I knew led to the highway. Only then did I ease up on the gas, my hands aching from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. I pulled into the first well-lit gas station I saw, parking under the bright lights of the pump area. My hands were still shaking as I finally managed to dial 911. I gave them a brief account of what happened, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. While I waited for the police to arrive, I got out to inspect the damage. The passenger window was a mess of broken glass and jagged edges. There was a dent in the door where someone had kicked it. And there, caught on a piece of glass, was a scrap of fabric, all that was left of the sleeve of the guy who'd tried to break in. The police took my statement, but I knew there wasn't much they could do. I couldn't identify any of the men, and I wasn't even sure exactly where it had happened. They told me I'd done the right thing by getting out of there, that things could have been much worse if I'd stayed. I called my dispatcher, explained what had happened. They told me to take the rest of the night off, to come in the next day to file a report. I nodded even though they couldn't see me, and hung up. As I climbed back into my truck, glass crunching under my boots, the reality of what had just happened hit me. I'd been seconds away from who knows what. If I hadn't reacted when I did, if I'd frozen for just a moment longer. I made it home that night, but sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those men surrounding my truck. I heard the sound of breaking glass, felt the panic of being trapped. Even now, months later, I still have nightmares about it. That night changed me. I'm more cautious now, always double-checking my routes before I head out. I don't do night deliveries in the city anymore if I can help it. And that sound, that sharp crack of glass breaking, it still makes me jump, even in broad daylight. They say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Maybe that's true, but it also leaves scars, invisible ones that don't fade with time. Every time I get behind the wheel of my truck, I remember that night in Chicago, and I'm reminded of how quickly an ordinary night can turn into a nightmare. It was just another day on the road. I'd been driving for hours, making my way through Pennsylvania on a long-haul trip. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, when I saw the sign for a truck stop ahead. My gas gauge was hovering near empty and my stomach was growling. Perfect timing, I thought. I pulled into the truck stop, a big place with a few dozen pumps and a bustling convenience store. Trucks of all sizes were parked in neat rows, their drivers taking a break from the monotony of the highway. I maneuvered my rig to an open pump and started filling up. That's when I noticed the tanker truck. It was massive, easily twice the size of my rig, with flammable written in bold red letters on its side. The driver was at the pump, going about his business like it was any other day. I didn't think much of it at first. Tankers were a common sight at truck stops. I was just about done fueling up when I heard it. A strange hissing sound coming from the direction of the tanker. At first, I thought it might be the normal sound of fuel pumping, but something about it seemed off. I looked over, squinting in the fading daylight. That's when I saw the spark. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but in that split second, I knew something was terribly wrong. Before I could even open my mouth to shout a warning, a small flame erupted from the side of the tanker. The driver must have seen it too, because he dropped the fuel nozzle and started backing away, his eyes wide with panic. The flame grew rapidly, feeding on the fumes and fuel. Within seconds, it had engulfed the entire side of the tanker. People started screaming. The peaceful evening erupted into chaos. Drivers abandoned their vehicles, running away from the growing inferno. The heat hit me like a wall. Even from where I stood, I could feel it on my face, see the air shimmering around the tanker. That's when the first explosion happened. It wasn't like in the movies. There was no fireball shooting into the sky. Instead, it was a deep, resonating boom that I felt in my chest more than I heard. The force of it knocked me off my feet, sending me sprawling onto the concrete. My ears were ringing as I scrambled to my feet. The tanker was fully engulfed now, flames reaching high into the darkening sky. Black smoke billowed upwards, thick and acrid. The air tasted of chemicals and burning rubber. People were running in every direction, some towards the convenience store, others to their vehicles. A woman stumbled near me, her face pale with shock. Without thinking, I grabbed her arm, helping her to her feet. "We need to get away from here," I shouted over the roar of the fire. I looked around, trying to assess the situation. The fire was spreading fast, igniting nearby vehicles. The heat was intense, making it hard to breathe. That's when I realized there were still people in some of the parked cars, frozen in fear or maybe unaware of the danger. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was adrenaline, maybe it was some deeply buried instinct. But I found myself running towards the nearest car, waving my arms and yelling for the occupants to get out. The family inside, a couple with 2 young kids, seemed to snap out of their daze. They scrambled out of the car just as another explosion rocked the area. This one was bigger than the first. The shockwave knocked us all to the ground. I could feel the heat on my back, singeing my clothes. The kids were crying, the parents trying to shield them with their bodies. "Go!" I yelled, pointing towards the road leading away from the truck stop. They didn't need to be told twice. I turned back to the inferno. The entire truck stop was ablaze now. The air was thick with smoke, making it hard to see and even harder to breathe. My lungs burned with every breath, but I could still hear voices, people calling for help, crying out in fear. I moved from vehicle to vehicle, shouting warnings, helping people out of their cars. The heat was unbearable. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes. My skin felt like it was blistering, but I couldn't stop. Not while there were still people in danger. Another explosion bigger than the last two combined. This time I saw the fireball, a massive orange bloom that lit up the night sky. The force of it threw me backwards. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of me. For a moment I just lay there, dazed and disoriented. That's when I saw him. A man trapped in his truck. The door was jammed and he was pounding on the window, his face a mask of terror. The flames were getting closer to his vehicle. I knew I had only seconds to act. I staggered to my feet, ignoring the pain in my body, the burning in my lungs. I ran to the truck, grabbed the door handle. It was hot enough to burn my palm, but I barely felt it. I pulled with all my strength, but the door wouldn't budge. The man inside was panicking now, his eyes wide with fear. I could see the flames reflecting in them. I looked around desperately for something to break the window. That's when I spotted a tire iron on the ground nearby. I snatched it up and swung it at the window with all my might. The glass spiderwebbed but didn't break. I swung again and again. On the third hit, the window shattered. I reached in, ignoring the jagged glass cutting into my arm, and helped the man climb out. We had barely made it a few steps when another explosion rocked the area. This one was close. Too close. I felt a searing pain on my back as debris rained down around us. We stumbled forward, half running, half crawling away from the inferno. I don't know how long we ran. Everything was a blur of heat, smoke, and pain. At some point, I became aware of sirens in the distance. Fire trucks and ambulances were arriving, their lights cutting through the smoke. We finally reached a safe distance, collapsing onto the grass by the side of the road. I lay there, gasping for breath, my whole body trembling. The man I'd rescued was beside me, coughing and shaking. From our vantage point, I could see the full extent of the destruction. The entire truck stop was engulfed in flames. Black smoke billowed into the night sky, blocking out the stars. The heat was still intense, even from this distance. Paramedics found us there, treating our burns and cuts. They wanted to take me to the hospital, but I refused. I couldn't leave, not yet. I needed to know that everyone had made it out. As the firefighters battled the blaze, I sat on the back of an ambulance, a blanket around my shoulders. I watched as they brought out survivor after survivor, some injured, all shell-shocked. The relief I felt each time I saw another person emerge from the smoke was indescribable. It was hours before the fire was finally under control. By then, the truck stop was nothing but a smoldering ruin. The tanker that had started it all was a twisted, blackened hulk. They say, time heals all wounds. Maybe it does, but some scars you carry with you forever. It was just another night on the road. I'd been driving for hours, the endless Florida highway stretching out before me. The clock on my dashboard read 2:37 a.m. when I pulled into a truck stop just outside of Tallahassee. I needed coffee, a bathroom break, and to stretch my legs before finishing the last leg of my haul. The truck stop was like any other. A sprawling parking lot filled with semis, a convenience store with flickering fluorescent lights, and a small diner attached. A few other drivers milled about, most looking as tired as I felt. I parked my rig and headed towards the store, my boots crunching on the gravel. That's when I first saw her. She was standing near the edge of the parking lot, partially hidden in the shadows cast by the overhead lights. Something about her posture caught my attention. She seemed tense, almost hunched over, like she was trying to make herself invisible. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to approach her, In this line of work, you learn to be cautious around strangers, especially at this hour. But something in my gut told me this wasn't right. I changed course, walking towards her slowly. As I got closer, I could see she was young, probably in her early 20s. Her clothes were dirty and disheveled, and she was shivering despite the warm Florida night. When she saw me approaching, her eyes widened with fear. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice low and calm. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She looked around frantically, as if checking to see if anyone else was watching. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Please, I need to get away from here. They're after me." I felt my stomach drop. "Who's after you?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew the answer. "The men who took me," she said, her voice breaking. "I escaped, but they'll be looking for me. Please, can you help me get to the police?" In that moment, everything changed. What had started as a routine pit stop had suddenly turned into something out of a nightmare. I looked around the truck stop, half expecting to see these men she was talking about. The parking lot seemed empty, but every shadow suddenly looked threatening. "Okay," I said, making a split-second decision. "My truck's right over there. I can take you to the police station." Relief washed over her face, and she nodded frantically. We started walking quickly towards my truck. I could hear her breathing heavily beside me, and I realized my own heart was pounding in my chest. We were about halfway to my truck when I heard the sound of tires screeching. A beat-up sedan came tearing into the parking lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The girl beside me let out a small whimper. "That's them," she whispered, her voice filled with terror. I didn't wait to see more. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing her arm and sprinting towards my truck. I could hear car doors slamming behind us, followed by shouts. We reached my truck and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. I managed to unlock the door and practically shoved the girl inside before scrambling into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life just as I saw two men running towards us in my side mirror. I threw the truck into gear and slammed on the accelerator. The tires spun for a moment before catching, and we lurched forward. That's when I heard the first gunshot. The sound was deafening in the quiet night. I ducked instinctively, and beside me the girl screamed. I heard a ping as a bullet hit the side of my trailer. "Get down!" I yelled as I swerved out of the parking lot and onto the main road. More shots rang out behind us. I heard the rear window shatter and glass rain down into the cab. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, watching the speedometer climb. The truck groaned under the sudden acceleration, but I pushed it harder than I ever had before. In my rearview mirror, I could see the sedan following us, gaining ground. Another shot, and I felt the truck shudder. They must have hit a tire. The steering wheel began to pull to the right, and I had to fight to keep us on the road. Beside me, the girl was sobbing, her face buried in her hands. I saw an exit coming up and made a split-second decision. I cut across 2 lanes of traffic, ignoring the blaring horns of other vehicles. The sedan followed, but the driver wasn't as skilled at maneuvering. They clipped the guardrail, slowing them down. I took the exit at full speed, the truck swaying dangerously as we rounded the curve. The road ahead was darker, lined with trees on both sides. I killed the headlights, plunging us into near-total darkness. It was risky, but I hoped it would make us harder to follow. For what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I drove like that. No lights, taking random turns, constantly checking the rearview mirror for signs of pursuit. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I could feel sweat soaking through my shirt. Finally, when I was sure we'd lost them, I pulled over to the side of the road. For a moment, the only sound was our heavy breathing and the ticking of the engine as it cooled. "Are you okay?" I asked the girl, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. She nodded, unable to speak. In the dim light, I could see she was pale as a ghost, her eyes wide with shock. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Okay, we need to get to the police. Do you know where the nearest station is?" She shook her head. I reached for my phone with trembling hands, ready to look it up, when I saw headlights approaching in the distance. Fear gripped me again. Had they found us? But as the vehicle got closer, I saw the familiar shape of a police cruiser. I've never been so relieved to see flashing lights in my life. I stepped out of the truck, waving my arms to flag them down. As the cruiser pulled up beside us, I realized the full weight of what had just happened. We'd escaped. We were safe. The rest of the night was a blur of police statements and questions. I told them everything. About meeting the girl, the men who chased us, the gunshots. They took the girl somewhere safe, and a detective told me they'd been tracking this trafficking ring for months. As I sat in the police station waiting to be cleared to leave, I couldn't stop replaying the events in my mind. The sound of the gunshots, the fear in the girl's eyes, the feeling of utter helplessness as we fled. I've been driving trucks for over a decade and I thought I'd seen it all, but nothing could have prepared me for that night. It was supposed to be just another routine delivery. I've been driving trucks for over a decade, and I've seen my fair share of weird stuff on the road. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night in Oregon. I was hauling a load of electronics to a warehouse just outside of Portland. It was late, probably around 11 p.m., and I was looking forward to getting this delivery over with so I could grab some sleep. The GPS led me down a series of increasingly narrow roads until I found myself on a poorly lit industrial street. The warehouse was at the end of the street, a big, gray building with a few flickering lights illuminating the loading dock. As I approached, something felt off. There were no other trucks around, which was unusual for a place like this. Normally, there'd be at least a few other drivers making late-night deliveries. I pulled up to the loading dock and cut the engine. The silence was eerie. No forklift sounds, no workers calling out to each other, just nothing. I grabbed my clipboard and hopped out of the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel. That's when I heard it. Voices coming from around the side of the building. They were hushed, urgent. My first thought was that maybe some workers were taking a smoke break. But as I got closer, I realized this was something else entirely. I peered around the corner of the warehouse, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There were 5 men standing in a tight circle. 4 of them were facing outward, hands hovering near their hips in a way that made me certain they were armed. The 5th man was on his knees in the middle, his hands tied behind his back. One of the standing men was speaking in a low, threatening tone. "You thought you could screw us over? Nobody steals from us and gets away with it." The man on his knees was pleading, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, I can explain. It wasn't me, I swear. I can get you your money." I knew instantly that I was witnessing something I shouldn't be seeing. My mind was screaming at me to turn around, to get back to my truck and drive away as fast as I could. But my body wouldn't move. I stood there, frozen, watching the scene unfold. Suddenly, one of the standing men turned his head slightly, and his eyes locked onto mine. For a split second, we just stared at each other, both of us equally surprised. Then he shouted, "We've got company." Everything happened so fast after that. The men spun around, and I saw the glint of metal as they pulled out their guns. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, my legs feeling like lead as I sprinted back towards my truck. The first gunshot cracked through the air just as I reached the cab. I heard the bullet whiz past my ear, so close I could feel the air disturbed by its passage. I yanked open the door and threw myself inside, fumbling with the keys. More shots rang out, the sound deafening in the quiet night. I heard the ping of bullets hitting the trailer behind me. The engine roared to life and I slammed the truck into gear, my foot pressing the accelerator to the floor. The truck lurched forward, tires squealing on the pavement. In my side mirror, I could see the men running after me, still firing. The rear window shattered, showering me with bits of glass. I ducked down as low as I could while still being able to see the road, praying that none of the bullets would find their mark. I sped down the industrial street, taking turns at random, just trying to put as much distance between me and those men as possible. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of the steering wheel. I kept expecting to feel the punch of a bullet at any moment. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I realized I couldn't hear gunshots anymore. I chanced to look in my mirrors and saw no sign of pursuit. But I didn't slow down. I kept driving, my mind racing as fast as the truck. I needed to call the police, but I was afraid to stop. What if those men were still out there looking for me? What if they had friends in the area? I fumbled for my phone with one hand, trying to keep the truck steady with the other. It took me 3 tries to dial 911. My fingers were shaking so badly. When the dispatcher answered, I blurted out everything in a rush. The warehouse, the armed men, the guy on his knees, the shooting. I was barely making sense, but the dispatcher managed to calm me down enough to get the important details. They told me to drive to the nearest police station, giving me directions. I followed them in a daze, constantly checking my mirrors for any sign of pursuit. Every car I saw made me flinch, wondering if it was those men coming to finish what they started. When I finally pulled into the police station parking lot, I nearly collapsed with relief. Officers were already waiting outside, hands on their weapons as they approached my truck cautiously. I stepped out with my hands raised, not wanting to make any sudden moves. The next few hours were a blur of questions and statements. I told the police everything I had seen and heard. They took pictures of my truck, documenting the bullet holes and shattered window. Detectives were called in, and I heard them talking about drug deals and organized crime. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. I had stumbled into something dangerous, something that could have easily cost me my life. If that man hadn't turned his head at that exact moment, if I had been a second slower in running away, I couldn't bear to think about it. The police finished taking my statement just as the sun was starting to rise. They told me they would be in touch if they needed any more information, and that I should be careful in case those men were still out there. As if I needed reminding. I climbed back into my truck, the cab still smelling of gunpowder and fear. The events of the night kept replaying in my mind. The hushed voices, the glint of guns in the dim light, the sound of bullets hitting metal. I knew that this night would stay with me for a long time to come. As I pulled out of the police station, heading towards the nearest truck stop where I could finally get some rest, one thought kept running through my mind. In all my years on the road, nothing could have prepared me for that night. Hey there again. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel. This will really help the channel to grow and you can be notified of the new videos. And I have something more for you. I chose another video for you to watch. Just click the card here to go to the video. Hope you like it. See you there.